right, good morning. Let's come to order and go on the record, please. I'm Charlotte Mitchell, Chair of the Utilities Commission, and with me this morning are Commissioners Brown Bland, Clodfelter, Hughes, and McKissick. Session Law 2021-165 directs the Commission to develop by no later than December 31st, 2022, a carbon plan that takes reasonable steps to reduce carbon dioxide emissions in this state from electric generating facilities owned or operated by Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas by 70% from 2005 levels by 2030, and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. On November 29, 2021, the Commission ordered Duke to file a proposed carbon plan by no later than May 16, 2022. The session law further directs that the development of the carbon plan include stakeholder input. The Commission has ordered Duke to conduct at least 3 stakeholder meetings prior to May 13, 2022. The first of these meetings occurred on January 25th, the second occurred on February 23rd, and the third occurred on March 22nd. All of these meetings have been moderated by third-party facilitator Great Plains Institute. The Commission is closely monitoring the stakeholder process, and we are here this morning for the purpose of receiving a third update on the sufficiency of the process. This session is being transcribed, and the transcription will be filed in the docket as it has been previously. All right, this morning we're going to take the same approach that we've taken the previous 2 updates. We'll begin with Duke. Duke should attempt to limit comments to about 10 minutes in duration. Following Duke, we will take questions from commissioners if there are any, and then we'll hear from the public staff. Public staff should do its best to limit your remarks to 5 minutes if possible, and then we'll see if commissioners have questions for you. Interveners to this proceeding who've pre-registered to provide an update will be allowed around 5 minutes to do so, and maybe ask questions by the Commission as well. The following interveners have pre-registered, and we'll take them in this order: NCSEA, CCEBA, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, Sierra Club, and Natural Resources Defense Council, and then finally the Clean Power Suppliers Association. All right, just again, as I've done in the past, want to stress that you all should do your best to limit your remarks to sufficiency of process. That's why we're here this morning. Please avoid going into substantive issues. Just focus on process this morning. All right, with that, we will go ahead and get started. Duke, you all may proceed. And council, make sure to introduce yourselves for the record when you get to the stand.
Good morning, Chair Mitchell, Commissioners. Jack Durack here on behalf of Duke Energy Progress, Duke Energy Carolinas. I'm joined by co-counsel Brett Bryshort, law firm McGuire Woods. And for the record, I want to note that I do have Carolina blue on my tie, my suit, and my shirt. So I'm doing my best to keep all the bases covered this morning on a momentous day in the Carolinas. So
smart move, Mr. Durack.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm going to quickly turn things over to Rebecca Doolin, who has previously presented to this commission regarding the stakeholder process. And so I'll turn things over to her now.
Great. Thank you, Jack. And for the record, I am Rebecca Doolin. I am Duke Energy's Director of Stakeholder Engagement. And good morning, Chair Mitchell, commissioners. It's a pleasure to be back with you this morning. And the companies appreciate the opportunity to provide you an update on the stakeholder process that we are undertaking related to the development of the carbon plan. As Chair Mitchell mentioned earlier, we held our last large stakeholder meeting on March 22nd. And again, we had a really broad attendance, robust attendance. Approximately 400 people attended virtually. The agenda was developed in large part responsive to what we heard from stakeholders in the previous stakeholder meeting, and also the discussion that we had with you earlier in March. We made a point to emphasize to stakeholders how we were taking their feedback into account. Based on the conversations we had in this room, we felt that it was important for stakeholders to understand how we were taking their feedback into account, and also provide specific examples. Chair Mitchell, I believe you mentioned this in our last conversation around this, to provide specific examples to stakeholders of how the process has been changed to take their feedback into account, and also how our modeling inputs and assumptions were evolving based on the stakeholder feedback that we were hearing. We addressed a number of specific topics at the meeting, again, largely responsive to what we heard from stakeholders as being of interest to them. Some of those were based on what we heard from public staff in this setting the last time that we were together, where they had identified a number of topics that they thought would be of interest to serve as technical subgroups. But given the amount of time that we had leading into the March 22nd meeting, we took those topics and put them as specific topics for the March 22nd meeting. That includes demand response, distributed energy resources, and the company's methodology for calculating estimates of transmission costs. We also heard an update, or stakeholders heard an update from Duke on the EEDSM collaborative, which had held a specific meeting dedicated to the carbon plan development. So the larger stakeholder group heard an update from the folks leading that work. And we also brought in a third party to provide a primer of sorts on the North Carolina Transmission Planning Collaborative process. We understood there to be some confusion, a lot of folks newly interested in the North Carolina Transmission Planning Collaborative. So we brought in Rich, his last name is Wudika, Rich Wudika, who is the third party administrator and facilitator of the NCTPC process. So we intentionally targeted these topics as responsive to what we understood stakeholders wanted to hear more about. In the meeting, we also provided an update on our current development of modeling assumptions, how those assumptions were being developed, and how that was responsive to what we have heard from stakeholders, and provided a significant amount of detail around those modeling assumptions, understanding that those are still preliminary draft under development, but thought it was important to go ahead and provide that information as much as we could to stakeholders at that point in time. We also provided details on the portfolios and pathways that are being developed. There were, at that point in time, 6 potential portfolios and pathways, and we provided detail down to the specific technologies and the specific volumes of those technologies that we were incorporating into each of those 6 draft preliminary portfolios that were under development. We also heard from one of the stakeholder groups who requested to present to, in the stakeholder meeting, to present their own modeling analysis through their own consultant. And so we really appreciated that, appreciated the request from the stakeholder, which we were able to accommodate. And so I think that was helpful for stakeholders to hear a different perspective other than just what Duke has under development. With regard to information sharing, we have talked about this and heard from stakeholders their desire to receive additional information, even if it is preliminary, understanding that it's preliminary and draft, but to receive information prior to the filing of the carbon plan on May 16th. And so we, in the March 22nd stakeholder meeting, we provided a plan to stakeholders that detailed that we would be providing draft preliminary modeling inputs and assumptions, a subset of those, on April 15th. And we also committed to sharing the full Encompass data set by May 16th. And so this is a conversation that we had last time with regard to how quickly Duke could provide the full Encompass data set. And so we had committed in the March 22nd meeting to be able to provide that on the day that we file, on May 16th. I think all of this was quite relevant to come up in the stakeholder meeting because just a few hours later, your order came out providing us guidance, and we appreciate the guidance on information sharing and requiring the companies to make to provide certain information and make a filing with regard to specifically the inputs and assumptions that will be shared in advance of filing. we're looking at that and preparing for a filing to be made later this week, I believe tomorrow. We do think that what we shared with stakeholders exceeds the requirements that are set forth in your order with regard to providing the full Encompass data set on May 16th, and also the commitment to share the initial subset of information on April 15th. Commission's order also encourages additional technical subgroups, and we're continuing to evaluate that. I think that a lot of what was shared in the March 22nd meeting speaks to the intent of this, at least as it's described in the Commission's order, in order to facilitate additional information sharing. So you will see in the presentation material, there was significant detail shared about where the modeling assumptions stand today and how those portfolios are being developed. And we are continuing to evaluate what subgroups will be appropriate for the future. We are planning for a subgroup on to address the environmental justice issues that are so important, and also to address the community impacts to those communities that will or may experience coal retirement coal facility closures, coal retirements in the future. Those are important conversations to have, and it's important that the company approaches it in a very thoughtful way. So we are working through the best way to do this and are planning to begin that. And I should emphasize that that's an ongoing conversation, not just a one meeting and done. But planning to begin those meetings in late April or early May, with the intent that as I said, they're ongoing conversations through the development and the execution of the carbon plan. I think that's all that I have to share for the update this morning. I can't emphasize enough that we appreciate the meaningful participation of stakeholders throughout this entire process, and also appreciate the Commission's interest and information that's been shared with us to help guide the stakeholder process, and this opportunity to hear from stakeholders and from the Commission as we all go through this for the first time together. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Dillon. Anything to add, Mr. Durack?
No, not
Okay.
this time. Thank you.
All right, let me check in with commissioners to see if there are questions for Duke. You have questions? All right, Commissioner Kleinfelter.
So when I looked at the slide deck for the third meeting, I saw the word pathways, and it jumped out at me because that's a topic of interest. And when I looked then at the presentation materials to the workshop, it seems that pathways is being used in a different sense than what I would have assumed. It's being used in the sense of describing different end states. I think of pathways as more connoting milestones, timetables, sequencing, and those sorts of things, not alternative end states. So my question is really, has there been any discussion in the stakeholder meetings about those kinds of issues? Timing, sequencing of retirements and additions or changes or modifications, and how those might affect the issue of least cost. Has that been a topic that's been discussed in the stakeholder meetings?
Good question. Thank you for asking it. I guess I would not necessarily think of obviously there are the end state informs somewhat the particular steps that are going to be required to get there. And so I think while it was presented in the form of an end state that has embedded in it a series of assumptions about certain things that have to happen to get to those end states. And I wouldn't say we had detailed conversation about each and every step along the way, but I think for those who are familiar with the range of regulatory processes and specific decisions that would be required to get to those end states, I think presenting the end states does really paint, show a picture of what is going to take to get there. So to get into the level of depth of the specifics of every schedule that's required to get to those end states, no, we're not at that point to have those discussions. But I think the end state picture we gave is meaningful and does give a lot of information about the necessary steps it would take to get there.
Thank you for that. I'm trying to stay away from substantive questions, but I'm just interested in what's been discussed. And as you know, in the IRP process, we get a short-term action plan, but frankly, I consider that something of a black box. And I was just interested in whether there was discussion of a much more granular discussion of how you get from A to B and how that might affect or inform your choice about what B is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And we will, I mean, that is something we're teasing out ourselves, and we anticipate providing a lot more information as we are putting ourselves together in our plan.
Got it. I'll stay with the process question for now. Thanks.
Commissioner McKissick.
Thank you, Chair Mitchell. Just a couple of questions. And I also was concerned about Duke's approach to cost-related issues. It seems that one of the things which I'm reading there is that in identifying different approaches that could be taken to achieve the goals of the carbon plan, there will be some type of cost that will be extrapolated to more or less evaluate different strategies and their effectiveness, which goes back to kind of some of the least cost issues raised by Commissioner Clodfelter. Can you share right now preliminarily, I mean, how that is going to take place? And I think about it particularly in the context of issues that have come up before relating to cost estimates and cost comparisons, particularly when you're looking at things from a very broad and big picture level, from what I call probably a 30,000 or 50,000 foot level. So can you help with that some? How discrete, what type of analysis, how would the models that you're using attempt to address it?
So absolutely, our modeling is required to make a broad range of assumptions around future costs, and that's inherent in any long-range modeling exercise, and this one's no different in that respect than it occurs in an IRP. So obviously, as we have gone about the stakeholder process, one of the key things that we've asked for is stakeholder input into data sources and market data and real world project data that the stakeholders have that they can give to us so that we can do our best to make the most accurate projection of the assumed costs that are then baked into the modeling that results in an output of the modeling source. So and we've at various points in the stakeholder process, both formally and informally, have received some amount of input from stakeholders. We continue to remain open to further stakeholder input on that, but certainly agree with your point that the assumptions that one makes about costs will certainly have a very important impact on the outcome of the modeling exercise.
Okay. And I guess, when I sit back and I think about what we're doing right now, I mean, it's an initial carbon plan. It's going to be updated every 2 years. When those updates occur, how broad and expansive can we expect them to be? Are we looking at a tweaking like certain frequencies and then a more broader reevaluation on others? What is anticipated at this time so I can get some sense as to what the scope will be, the complexity will be, and the intervals where there will be what I call a thorough drill down versus perhaps a more skeletal approach?
Well, first, I'm just trying to survive until May 16th, Commissioner, and get you a good document on May 16th. But you raise a good question. And so I would say we're still thinking ourselves about what the future looks like. We'll obviously look for direction from the commission in terms of its expectation about reporting and check-ins and what future carbon plan processes may look like. We'll obviously open to stakeholder input on what that looks like. But I can say very confidently that future updates will include very specific updates on a set of actions and executable decisions that we've taken since you last gave us direction on what the carbon plan is. And then we'll also involve redoing, taking a new view of the carbon plan modeling. So absolutely, over time, there will be reiterative process as we continue to look at the short and long-term actions. And so I anticipate we would be reporting to you about what we've done in the short term, how we've taken specific steps to keep us on the particular pathways, while also revisiting the longer-term views of the carbon plan and how changes in assumptions, changes in circumstances, changes in a variety of factors may influence our decisions about the longer-term pathways.
Okay, thank you. Another issue that seems to have come up is the extent to which in the evaluation which is being conducted today, you'll be looking at potentially what could occur and the cost implications. We were joining, PJM or RTO. And to what extent do you anticipate as this moves forward, that will be one of the parameters that will be given some thought and reflection? Evaluation, I guess is a better way of putting it.
Yeah. So I think as we've stated the stakeholder, in response to those requests from stakeholders, our view at this time is that is twofold. First, we don't see any indication in HB 951 that there was an intention for us to evaluate that much of a fundamental departure from our current regulatory construct in the Carolinas. Equally as important, though, is the immense complexity of what it means to try to model that when we are in the midst of what is currently just what we have on the table, an immensely complex modeling exercise. So I think those two factors lead us to the conclusion that this is not the right time or context or form in which to evaluate that issue.
Okay. And then lastly, the non-disclosure agreements that would need to be signed for parties to get access to, I guess, data dealing with the modeling that's being conducted. And I guess, when will the full Encompass modeling information be shared with interested stakeholders? I mean, let me make sure I'm clear on that date, because I gather there are two dates that are
Correct.
are definitive.
That's right. So in response to your order, and as Rebecca explained, we already been heading in this direction and announced these plans on March 22nd. We're going to develop a list of draft Encompass inputs and assumptions that will be made available on April 15th. So very shortly, those will be made available in a data room site that stakeholders, interveners with NDAs can access. And then we are working night and day to make sure that we have the full Encompass data set, the entire set of information that we use to run the Encompass models. So this is the set of information that anyone who has Encompass can take that data set and replicate our modeling process and then make any changes they want to the modeling process. So that entire set of information, every single bit of it, will be made available on May 16th in a data room for all interveners that have executed confidentiality agreements. And you mentioned confidentiality agreements, so we will have a process in place, and we'll be describing that process in our filing with the commission tomorrow to let interveners know how to go about accessing those NDAs, executing them so that they're ready in advance of April 15th and obviously May 16th to get that information. And it's our standard NDA form that we've executed hundreds of times with interveners in these regulatory processes.
So it's a standard type form, nothing unique about the
That's
one that's
correct.
going to be submitted.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Hughes.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate all the examples of how things I think went well. I just wondered, to humor me, not every ball goes in through the through the basket. Were there anything that we should know about that maybe you would do differently next time around? The next carbon plan we do?
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, you guys are way ahead of
Yeah,
us.
no. But in all seriousness, I imagine we may hear some limitations later in the morning. So I'd like to hear it from your perspective.
Let me start, then I'll hand off to Rebecca. I think the biggest thing to realize is I won't call it a perfect storm, but something in the vein of a perfect storm where we have an incredibly tight timeline. We have a first of its kind, immensely complex filing, and we have a new model. So I think the combination of those three factors has led to a lot of challenges in in this process from a timing perspective, and I think is somewhat at the root of some of the frustration we've heard from some stakeholders regarding their abilities to do things in advance of May 16th. So without overpromising or being too optimistic, I think, and I'm hopeful that the tenor and ability for us to engage on these issues pre-filing is going to be a really different picture future carbon plans. Not saying it's going to be perfect, not saying there's going to be everyone's going to be happy or that we can do everything that stakeholders have asked of us or that some stakeholders have asked of us or expect of us. But I'm hopeful that future carbon plan cycles will be a little different because of getting past those three really significant challenges that we've been tackling in a very compressed timeline of just a couple months. Is there anything you'd add to that, Rebecca?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think one of the issues to tackle as well is this notion of attempting to achieve consensus on certain issues through a stakeholder process. I think it's really challenging given a number of the factors that Jack has laid out, but and from the chair where I sit, particularly the timing aspects of things. So trying to change this from a 2.5 month, 3 month stakeholder engagement process at most to potentially additional time for that. And but I think that's one that will continue to challenge us, is this notion of how do you achieve consensus or work to achieve consensus with so many different stakeholder interests represented and in the room? What does that look like? And so I think that's one that we'll continue to grapple with. I do think with having this as an experience to reflect back on, that we'll be able to hopefully plan meetings in a way that allows for more targeted stakeholder engagement with particular groups that have particular interests, kind of like we did with these technical subgroups. And that will, I think, that having more of those will be very helpful to the development. We're just so hamstrung by the timing of things, and when certain information needs to be at a near final state in order to actually do the modeling, that it challenges us to be able to operate in that paradigm that may work better going forward. But I think our laundry list of lessons learned will be very long, and with a little more time to reflect on it and talk with our other stakeholder groups about it, we'll have more clarity around it.
And maybe if I can tag on that, I think great points that she's raised, and Rebecca got me thinking about sort of stakeholder consensus and what that looks like. And I think your order obviously creates some very substantial and good expectations about the need to continue to drive and seek to achieve consensus post-filing. So obviously from the date on which we file on May 16th to the date that you've requested us to submit that issues list, I mean, the stakeholder engagement is going to be continuing in full force and effect in that time period. And I think that's an important point to just affirm again that stakeholder engagement doesn't end with the filing date. And I think we have in the past achieved some consensus on some very important issues pre-filing. I would suggest, and I think I may have mentioned this last time, I would suggest that most times when we've done that, it's in a very discrete topics in a very targeted ways where we can come to consensus, for example, on Q reform with a very specific issue. I think with a complex issue like carbon plan is closer to a rate case. And if you think about rate cases, the consensus items tend to emerge post-filing as you kind of go through the regulatory process, and parties are required to not just talk in a room. There's value in talking in a room, but there's also value in putting firm positions on paper, making filings that can help to facilitate consensus building in a way that's not better than, just different than the stakeholder engagement that occurs pre-filing. So I think as we continue to think about lessons learned from this process, it'll both be looking at what we did pre-filing as well as what we learn about stakeholder consensus that can be built post-filing. And I think we remain optimistic there'll be some opportunities for that in this proceeding as well.
Thanks for that thoughtful response.
One additional question. In the stakeholder meetings, has there been any significant discussion or time spent on understanding and discussing your technology screens that you're using to develop the different scenarios? Has that been a topic that anybody's wanted to talk about?
And we say technology, I can start and then I'll hand off the, so technology screen can mean a lot of different things to different people. We certainly have talked about the technologies that we think are most likely to be part of the carbon plan, and that by definition sort of, in some forms or fashion, you're sort of acknowledging that there's other potential future technologies that are not ready to be modeled at this time. And I think we've
Or
touched on-
potential present technologies that are not being modeled. And that's really the point of the question is, has there been any discussion about the topic of which technologies are ready to be modeled? Has that been a topic of discussion in the stakeholder meetings?
Yeah, I believe it has. Rebecca, you can add
Can
here.
you,
I mean,
can you say a little bit more about sort of, is there consensus or is there additional sessions or workshops on that topic, or sort of what's happened?
Sure, I can give it a stab. So I think that it has been part of the conversation from the beginning. I mean, one of the issues that's of most interest to stakeholders is what resources are selectable by the model,
Right.
and what are the cost and operational assumptions that are included when you're modeling that particular resource. So from the very beginning, that's something that we've talked about as we have shaped up what are the technologies that we are considering, and again, the assumptions underlying those. And this is just my view, and others may have different views of this. I think that it was fairly clear what was, I think there was reasonable consensus around what the types of technologies are that should be included. More of the conversation has been around what are the assumptions, the specific assumptions associated with each of those technologies, and less of a conversation around, I think you should include this other particular resource type. It should be a selectable in your model, and you don't have that resource under consideration right now. I trust that my colleagues who will present later will give their views on that if they see it differently. But Commissioner Clodfelter, the conversation has been much more interested in, for those selectable resources, what are the assumptions driving the selection of those resources, as opposed to, oh, I think, there's this new technology where we take, space dirt from Mars and create I'm trying to come up with something that would not actually be, where we're not actually talking about the substance of things. So I think that's been that's my view of where the conversation has been.
All right, any additional questions for Duke? Commissioner McKissick?
One quick one. I know you said the environmental justice subgroup would be continuing to meet. To what extent will those meetings, the same meeting of that particular subgroup and other groups, continue as this moves forward? I mean, you have the deadlines coming up pretty quickly. So, I mean, what type of substantive, meaningful engagement will this subgroup that I identified and others have as things move forward?
Sure. We see these subgroups as different than, for instance, the technical subgroups that were focused on modeling assumptions. These are important conversations with communities, with particular stakeholders who have a very important and discrete interest in, this is almost more toward the implementation and execution of the carbon plan, but the conversations are so important that we want to start now, as opposed to waiting until we actually have a carbon plan in the beginning of next year. So these are, and you see these conversations taking place all over the country as utilities and communities are moving together toward a path of decarbonization. So I really think of this as important holistic conversations that are important regardless of the carbon plan, but become so much more heightened as a result of the carbon plan. And again, I can't emphasize enough that it's important to Duke that they are done in a thoughtful way, because these are they can be difficult conversations to have. We haven't done this before, and so that's really a part of Duke's continued community engagement and working with communities that have historically been overlooked the energy economy standpoint. So it's very important to us, and it will be an ongoing conversation.
I appreciate that perspective. I think it is important that they remain ongoing. And I think that type of thoughtful interchange and dialogue can be meaningful and insightful and significant. So I take it from your remarks is that you would assume that these subgroups would continue to function and operate even after the carbon plan is submitted, just in terms more generally providing a resource and tool for exchanging ideas and openly facilitating communications.
That's absolutely the case. And we'll take our cues also. We haven't talked with stakeholders to begin with on what they want from the conversations and how they see the cadence of these meetings taking place and what their needs are. And so I'm just giving you my perspective as we sit here today that's not informed by hearing from these communities yet and hearing from these historically underserved populations. So that's just want to emphasize again that may adjust based on what we hear from them, but that is certainly the view that we have today.
Thank you very much.
All right, one last call. Questions for Duke? All right, thank you, Ms. Doolin, Mr. Drack. All right, next up we have NCSEA, or actually public staff, I'm sorry, Ms. Lure.
Good morning, Nadia Lure with the public staff, and with me is Jeff Thomas and with the Energy Division in case there are any more technical questions. So with regard to the third stakeholder meeting, the public staff appreciated the discussions that took place, particularly around distributed energy resources and transmission planning, as well as the continued opportunity for stakeholders to ask questions and make comments during the meeting. We first note, as Ms. Doolin stated earlier, that Duke has now provided information to stakeholders regarding when it will be sharing inputs, assumptions, and other data. It has committed to sharing its draft preliminary modeling assumptions by April 15th and the full set of final modeling assumptions on May 16th when it files its proposed carbon plan. We think this is a good compromise that enables stakeholders to begin their analysis sooner, and we appreciate this commitment. We also note that the Commission's recent order issued on March 22nd directed Duke to provide a comprehensive list of inputs and assumptions that can be released prior to the filing of the carbon plan by April 5th, which is tomorrow. And this will be helpful for stakeholders as well, and we look forward to reviewing that list. With regard to discovery, Duke has stated that discovery will begin on May 16th with the filing of the proposed carbon plan. The public staff plans to submit one or more data requests ahead of May 16th and to share them with other parties, with the expectation that Duke will not begin working on them until it files its carbon plan on May 16th. But we hope that by providing data requests early, other stakeholders will be able to review those and avoid duplicate requests. And the public staff has no further comments at this time on the stakeholder process.
All right, Mr. Thomas, anything you want to add?
Nothing for me.
Okay. Questions for the public staff? Commissioner McKissick? I know I'm pausing just to make sure. Okay. Okay.
Question, but thank you for your moving ahead with circulating your draft data requests. That's a very good step. Thank you.
Ms. Lure, one of the things we heard Mr. Drack and Ms. Doolin talk about was the plan to, or perhaps Duke has already engaged in letting stakeholders know where stakeholder feedback is being incorporated into the processes that Duke will use. Can you sort of talk more about what you heard from Duke on those points?
Right. Well, we did, during the third stakeholder meeting, there were, Duke did indicate where it had taken feedback from stakeholders and incorporated that into its planning. And, I expect that we will see in its filing of its proposed carbon plan, an indication again of where it has incorporated stakeholder feedback.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, checking in one last time to see if there are questions for Ms. Luer, Mr. Thomas. All right, well, thank you both very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, NCSEA, Mr. Ledford, you're up.
Good morning, Chair Mitchell, members of the commission. My name is Peter Ledford, and I'm here on behalf of the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association. NCSEA appreciates the opportunity to present this morning on the adequacy of Duke's carbon plan stakeholder process. As I noted in our presentation last month, NCSEA is concerned about the differences in timing between Duke's filing of its proposed carbon plan and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, offshore wind lease block auction for the Wilmington East area. We greatly appreciate Duke sharing preliminary information with stakeholders at the last stakeholder meeting, but there was not substantive discussion of the timing differences between the two issues at that stakeholder meeting. Since that last stakeholder meeting, BOEM has announced the date of the Wilmington East lease sale, which will be May 11th, 5 days before Duke files its proposed carbon plan. NCSEA has a strong interest in seeing wind generation developed offshore of North Carolina, regardless of whether the off-taker is Duke or another utility. As such, we believe that transparency is paramount, and all bidders to the auction should know whether Duke's proposed carbon plan calls for offshore wind or not. NCSEA requests that Duke, or the Commission direct Duke to, file a letter with the Commission by May 1st detailing, first, if its proposed carbon plan will call for offshore wind, and if so, how many megawatts, and in what year. NCSEA believes that this will create a level playing field for the lease auction and will help North Carolina move forward as a hub for offshore wind energy in the Southeast. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Ledford. Let me see if there are questions for you, commissioners. Mr. Ledford, just one question. Help us understand why directing Duke to file the information that NCSEA has requested creates a level playing field. Just connect those dots for us.
Duke is registered to be a bidder in the BOEM offshore lease auction, as well as approximately 15 other businesses, including a number of NCSEA's members. Only Duke will know at the time of the BOEM auction if their carbon plan calls for offshore wind. So they will have advantage over other participating bidders as to whether or not that's a viable offtake solution for the lease auction.
Okay, thank you. All right, anything else for Mr. Ledford? Commissioner McKissick.
Yep. I understand why you would want to obtain the information which you've identified, but ultimately, at this point in time, we don't know what the outcome of the bidding will be. We don't know who will be the successful bidder. We don't know the viability longer term of building that generating capacity, or what it would take transmission-wise to get it where the power is actually needed. But it seems like there's a lot of unknowns that might best be addressed when we perhaps do an update of the carbon plan 2 years out. Can you comment upon those observations?
I acknowledge that the timing is less than ideal. But the fact is that the BOEM auction has been announced for May 11th, and businesses need to make financial decisions as to whether they're going to participate there. The auction for the Virginia Beach and the northeastern part of North Carolina's offshore wind occurred several years ago, and all of those issues were in place then. Where would they interconnect? Where would they, what would the off-taker be? The business that won that auction has entered into the PJM interconnection queue and is preparing to move forward with that. Anybody who wins this auction is going to have some business uncertainty associated with that. In terms of interconnection costs, timing, everything there. But we think that the information should at least be known among all the bidders so that they're on a level playing field.
Got it. And it seems like I read recently they even changed the configuration of the tracks.
Yes, they have moved things around. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. There's nothing further for NCSEA. Thank you, Mr. Ledford. All right, next up, we will hear from CCBA, Mr. Burns.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair, Commissioners. My name is John Burns. I'm General Counsel of the Carolinas Clean Energy Business Association. I'd first like to echo CCBA's or State CCBA's support for the request that Mr. Ledford just made regarding the wind information. We think that would be valuable to all bidders and would promote information parity among those that seek to bid into that process. Thank you for continuing to monitor and to provide the carbon and to guide the carbon plan stakeholder process. CCBA appreciates especially the involvement of our fellow stakeholders and Duke's willingness to consider and in many ways and instances accept comments and input from us and from other stakeholders. It's very much appreciated, and when they report that is accurate, they have done that on several instances. March 22nd stakeholder meeting was informative and helpful, especially those parts which dealt with the TPC process. For those who were new to that process, bringing in the third-party administrator of the TPC to address us was very helpful, and we appreciated that. We look forward to reviewing the proposal which will be issued in May, and we particularly look forward to tomorrow's list of the inputs and assumptions that Duke will provide consistent with your order of March 22nd. We do also appreciate Duke's commitment to issue the full Encompass data set along with the plan on May 16th. We think that's vital and provides us, I'm not going to say sufficient time to evaluate it because I think the whole process is very truncated, but certainly as much time as can reasonably be allowed. We will closely review and provide feedback on Duke's comprehensive list. We believe that among those inputs and assumptions should be the assumptions regarding modeling of transmission upgrades, as well as the basis for interconnection caps and restrictions that are assumed, we think, in the entire modeling process, particularly that latter issue of interconnection caps and limitations on solar interconnection that have been assumed in the stakeholder process so far. Some of the presentations that Duke has made have indicated some caps on the amount of solar interconnection, but the basis and assumptions behind those caps and why they are the level they are has not been as transparent, and we urge Duke and the Commission to provide and require that amount of transparency. While most of the focus during the stakeholder process has been on resource plan modeling, it has been clear that transmission and interconnection assumptions will have a tremendous effect on the outcome of that resource plan modeling. We urge Duke to provide such information as soon as possible and no later than with the release of the proposed carbon plan. CCBA believes that the stakeholder process thus far has been valuable. We appreciate Duke's responsiveness on many issues and the clear adjustments they've made when their statements in earlier meetings drew comments and suggestions from participants. You've asked us not to go into specifics, but there were particular issues related to exporting of carbon production into other states outside of North Carolina. Duke listened to our comments on that, made adjustments, and made commitments on March 22nd that were very helpful and appreciated. We do ask that the same responsiveness apply to the transmission interconnection issues that I mentioned. What is the nature and basis for constraints on interconnection that are built into the 2022 procurement and the carbon plan process? How will the carbon plan process work with the TPC process to accomplish the kind of proactive transmission planning that is agreed among almost all stakeholders and Duke itself? There is broad consensus that such proactive transmission planning is needed, but what is unclear is how the TPC process and the carbon plan process will work together to achieve it. And these are absolutely vital and will inform our understanding and critique of the eventual draft carbon plan. That concludes my remarks, and I appreciate the opportunity to address you today, and will be happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right, thank you, Mr. Burns. Let me check in with colleagues. Questions for CCBA? Commissioner McKissick.
Yep, one quick question. I would agree with your assessment that the more information you have on these caps is important. What type of information has been provided at this time related to those limitations? Because I can see how they would have far-reaching implications.
It has been discussed really at a high level, where Duke has said that there would be a certain cap, for instance, on the 2022 procurement. It has provided Duke staff members to answer questions as part of the stakeholder process, but the level of detail doesn't really dig down into why this particular limit, why it's more of a we need to cap it because we have interconnection limitations. We have areas of the state that need upgrades. It's more of a general discussion, and we think there's more detail needed. We joined CPSA in issuing a data request last week, which Duke responded to and said that they would provide information as part of the discovery process. We will provide that data request to the public staff, and we do appreciate the public staff's commitment to provide theirs early. We hope that that level of detail that was requested in that data request is the level of detail that will be presented by Duke. It's hard for me really to dig in because I don't have the technical expertise to tell you what's missing, honestly.
I appreciate your remarks, and I guess we'll wait to see what occurs, but I can see why that level of specificity would be needed and desirable.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Mr. Burns. You may
Thanks,
step
Madam Chair.
down. All right, we'll hear from SACE next. Mr. Jimenez.
Morning, Commissioners. Thank you, Chair Mitchell. Nick Jimenez with the Southern Environmental Law Center on behalf of interveners, SACE, Sierra Club, and NRDC, collectively SACE et al. Thank you for this opportunity to update the Commission. We appreciate the order regarding inputs and assumptions. We have tried to work with Duke on a mutually agreeable timeline for production of modeling inputs and part of the stakeholder process, and believe those discussions have been productive. We want to identify 3 items not specifically stated in the Commission's order that nonetheless will be important for Duke to provide to stakeholders, and recommend the Commission consider making these requirements. First, the inputs and assumptions provided under the order should also include the data sources from which the inputs were derived. And of course, the inputs should be provided for all scenarios, not just, for example, the reference case. Second, following up on Commissioner McKissick's question, the order requires data sets to be provided as soon as possible, which we have learned will be May 16th. It would be helpful to have a specific time frame, such as soon as possible, but no later than 10 days after Duke files the list of inputs and assumptions with the Commission. And finally, stakeholders need to be informed of any changes that Duke might make to the inputs and assumptions after they've been filed. Second issue I want to touch on briefly is transmission. It's come up a number of times. SACE et al. Appreciated the presentation from Mr. Wadika, consultant to the NCTPC, on the kind of process and overview of the NCTPC. Presentations and our stakeholder review of those presentations thus far indicate that the state will need quite a lot of transmission to meet the 2030 and 2050 goals. So clearly the NCTPC process will be crucial to the carbon plan itself, but there's still no clear connection between the carbon plan and the NCTPC process that we have come across. So I think the public staff in its report on the stakeholder process identified some of the questions that have come up, and I'd just like to highlight some of those and add to them. One is, for example, will Duke submit a public policy study scenario for its proposed carbon plan to the NCTPC? And relatedly, we would ask whether there will be one based on the final carbon plan. And could a study be completed in time to be considered before the carbon plan is approved at the end of this year? We recommend the commission investigate with the NCTPC how to align these two processes and how they will inform one another and take stakeholder comment on the response. And I just want to identify one bigger picture question regarding transmission that's also noted in the public staff's report, and that's whether our existing transmission planning process will be adequate to comply with the carbon plan requirements and H951, or whether we need a more active or proactive transmission planning process. The last point I want to highlight is the clean energy plan. So in its first order in this docket, the commission, back in November, the commission required the carbon plan stakeholder process to build on the clean energy plan and the 2020 IRPs. The commission wisely recognized that it would be efficient and advisable to build on the years of stakeholder and agency staff work that went into the clean energy plan and the principal reports that came out of it, the one on carbon reduction policy, sometimes called the E-100 report, and the utility business model report, the B1 report. But so far, the clean energy plan has not showed up in the carbon plan stakeholder process. So SACE et al. Are just unsure how Duke's initial carbon plan will build on those reports, but we certainly think it should. So thank you for your time. Be happy to take any questions.
Questions from commissioners? Commissioner McKissick.
So I know you've identified these three concerns this morning. Have you addressed them with Duke prior to today?
We have raised these concerns during the stakeholder process, not in this exact list, for sure.
Okay, but not in as succinctly. Okay. What feedback or reaction have you received to date? Or I guess that would be the thing to know.
So we've had a good discussion about providing stakeholder inputs and providing data inputs and assumptions. I'm trying to recall the agreement we came to with Duke, but we started to arrive at an agreement before the commission's order, as I think Duke discussed in its presentation. Transmission, I should correct myself. I don't think we've had a discussion with Duke following that presentation, but there was certainly discussion of it in the comments during that presentation, in the kind of Zoom comments. And I don't believe we've gotten a response about kind of how to align those two processes. And again, with the clean energy plan process, I know that's been brought up in those comments, and I don't recall a clear response.
Okay, thank you.
All right, anything further for SACE? All right, Mr. Jimenez, you may step down. Thank you very much for your comments today. All right, Mr. Snowden, CPSA.
Thank you, Chair Mitchell, Commissioners. Good morning. Ben Snowden with the law firm of Fox Rothschild for the Clean Power Suppliers Association. We'd like to thank you for your continued interest in the stakeholder process and for giving us the opportunity to present our views. We have appreciated Duke's continued engagement in the stakeholder process. And Ms. Dula mentioned this, at the meeting on March 22nd, Duke presented additional detail regarding its modeling for the carbon plan, including some specifics about pathways to compliance. Without getting into specifics, I will say that we believe Duke clearly has made some changes to its modeling in response to stakeholder feedback, which is a very positive sign. We also believe that the level of detail provided at the March 22nd meeting was a step in the right direction. And we eagerly await the filing from Duke tomorrow on when additional detail will be provided. CPSA had the opportunity at the March 22nd meeting to present our own preliminary modeling of carbon plan compliance. Great Plains, the facilitator, and Duke were very open to this. This presentation has generated some additional constructive dialogue among stakeholders, and we very much appreciated the opportunity to present that information. With regard to the commission's order also on March 22nd, we very much appreciate your focus on transparency and also efficiency in this process. We note that the commission's order encouraged Duke to conduct additional technical working group sessions with stakeholders. CPSA has requested that an additional working group session be held to dig into Duke's assumptions about the constraints on the ability to interconnect new generation each year. I echo Mr. Burns' concerns and statements about the impact of those assumptions on the carbon plan. I will say in response to Commissioner McKissick's questions, Duke has presented some information on these constraints. There was a previous technical working group on solar interconnection. I was not there. I was not able to attend that, but I have reviewed the presentation materials, talked to folks who were. My understanding is that, Duke has certainly presented information about past rates of interconnection. The primary, I think, intelligence we've gotten on the assumptions about future constraints has to do with the scheduling of line outages. I think that's one of the major reasons cited, but I think beyond that, we haven't gotten a lot of detail. I'm sure Duke can probably respond to that. And of course, the impact of line outages on timing also, depends on what upgrades have got to be made to the system. I think one of the main things that we're focused on is, if there are short-term limitations on, if we assume short-term limitations on the rate of interconnection, what are the potential impacts of those assumptions and that uncertainty on the ultimate plan, the end state, and also what are the steps that will be taken over the medium to long term to ramp up the rate at which interconnections can be accomplished. So we would very much appreciate it if Duke would take us up on our request to have a further session on that. Now, with regard to transmission, certainly I would like to reiterate, as I have before, the importance of deliberate transmission planning. CPSA believes, and we think that Duke and other stakeholders agree, that 951 compliance is probably not possible, or at a minimum will be significantly more expensive without proactive transmission planning and construction. In the stakeholder process and in other contexts, Duke has identified at least a few key upgrades to its system that it believes will undoubtedly be required to achieve 951 compliance. With regard to the TPC process, which we have been pretty engaged with, I would echo comments from Mr. Burns and Mr. Jimenez that despite being pretty engaged in that process, we are still struggling to understand, what the linkage will be between the TPC process and the carbon plan, how those two processes will inform each other, and ultimately how proactive transmission planning is going to get done through the TPC. Now, I think it's not surprising that there are a lot of question marks. This kind of process is really outside of what the TPC has previously done, even with its prior public policy studies. So to some extent, I think Duke, the TPC, other members of the TPC are sort of, trying to build the airplane in flight and really try to figure out how this is going to work. But it has been done in other jurisdictions for some period of time. So we think it's important to move forward with this. We do believe, though, I will say that Duke has been, I think, constructively engaging with CPSA and with other stakeholders in sort of figuring this out.
Mr. Snowden, I'm going to interrupt you. What jurisdictions
New
do you have in
Jersey,
mind?
New Jersey and Maryland have both done this, and there are other interstate efforts that have been driven by ISOs and reliability organizations.
Specifically, what have Maryland and New Jersey done?
I'm happy to provide additional information. I think that with Maryland, it was related to additional wind procurements, and I think there was a renewables procurement in New Jersey that incorporated that kind of planning. But that's for our consultants. That's where it's been done. We'd be happy to provide additional details.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I knew what you're talking about. Okay, please proceed.
Okay, thank you. So suffice it to say, we believe Duke has been constructively engaging with this process. There's not a lot of time to sort of get this right, so we We appreciate the commission's attention to the TPC process, and we would just ask that you all continue to remain, engaged with that process going forward. One final note on transmission as it relates to transparency, and I'll echo a bit of what Mr. Burns has said here. Most of the attention with regard to transparency in this process and requests for information have related to resource plan modeling, to the Encompass models, which of course are really the critical thing for the carbon plan. But it is important that stakeholders get more information about how Duke is modeling its the transmission upgrades that will be required for the carbon plan, and of course, in particular, the constraints on interconnection. So we have asked Duke for specific modeling information on this issue, and we hope that this information can be provided to stakeholders when the carbon plan is filed, rather than just through discovery after the fact. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, questions for Mr. Snowden? All right, Mr. Snowden, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Duke, any additional responses you'd like to provide?
Thank you, Chair Mitchell. We'll try to be as brief as possible here, but want to begin by just reiterating the appreciation we have for the stakeholder input we received today, as well as throughout this process. It's been very helpful to us. We know we have not always been on the same page on every issue, and but we do appreciate sincerely all the engagement we've had from stakeholders on this. We appreciate the thoughts we've heard this morning as well from a variety of perspectives. We also appreciate public staff's perspective and their creative thinking around developing discovery ahead of time so that we can do that in the most efficient way possible. And certainly agree that will be time well spent to facilitate efficient information exchange. So thank you for that idea. We'll just very briefly hit about 3 or 4 topics that were addressed, just as a few follow-up items, and then kind of wrap things up. So I'd say first, briefly, I want to touch on the comments regarding the BOEM, the timing of the carbon plan filing as it relates to the timing of the auction, the BOEM auction. A lot can be said about that issue. I think it's a very complex one. I think most fundamentally, I would say, in our discussion on March 22nd, we provided a preliminary pathway view of what role offshore wind will play in our preliminary draft, non-final proposed view of what the carbon plan may look like. So, as well as the amounts of it. So, as best I can tell, that's a lot of what was being asked has already been provided. So I'm not sure what else we would say in advance of May 16th that we haven't already said in that presentation. Just a couple other thoughts on that. I mean, that auction is but one of a myriad of complex commercial, technical, siting issues, procurement decisions, investment decisions that are going to be impacted over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years of this carbon plan process. I mean, it feels odd to single out this one particular decision that could be impacted in some form or fashion by what is just a draft proposed carbon plan for the company, not even the final carbon plan approved by this commission. So singling out that particular commercial decision amongst the myriad of other decisions being made by a range of market participants just feels odd from our perspective and unnecessary. And further, the parties, the dozen plus parties that are going to be submitting hundreds of millions of dollars of bids in this auction are sophisticated, technically savvy parties who are no doubt doing their own technical analysis of the value of the project, and are assessing the value of the project, not only as it may play a role in HB 951, but as it may play a role in other resource plans and other areas, other utilities. So, the point that was made about information parity, I think we kind of disagree with that as well, because, Duke is not being given insight into the complex analysis being done by these other parties. So to sort of require that of Duke kind of honestly doesn't feel consistent with that theme of information parity. So again, there's a March 16th deadline for a reason. we're going to be working hard and heavy over the next month to meet that deadline. And we don't think there's really any justification at this time based on that factor to require release of a draft carbon plan in advance of the 16th. Just a few other quick points in response to issues raised on behalf of SACE by Mr. Jimenez. There seemed to be a little lack of clarity in terms of the timing of when the draft modeling inputs and assumptions be made available. So just to be really clear, the draft input, the first batch of draft inputs and assumptions we made available on April 15th. So we'll be making a filing tomorrow to describe what it is we intend to provide, and then we'll move forward with providing the first batch of that on April 15th. So just wanted to make sure that was clear. Just briefly, I'll mention what I think we'll move past that because I think we're getting a little too far into substantive issues. We will absolutely in our carbon plan filing explain the ways in which the CEP, the clean energy process, has informed what we've done here. A lot of it has been helpful and informative. Some of it has reflected actually in HB 951 and the legislative mandates therein. But we absolutely will have a description of how that has informed what we are proposing. You heard a lot, obviously, about transmission and interconnection issues. So again, without going too far into substantive issues there, we absolutely hear the concerns that have been articulated. We sought to try to answer a lot of those questions to the best of our ability at the March 22nd meeting by providing a more fulsome description of both our views and what we know today about the transmission needs on the system, as well as providing a front row seat to hear about the NCTPC process. We've appreciate the engagement from many stakeholders now who are diving into the NCTPC process, and we think that's a good thing. We think that will drive that process to accomplish the goals that we think it can accomplish. So we appreciate that, and we will certainly, in the carbon plan filing on May 16th, have a wealth of information about how we see all the pieces of the transmission puzzle fitting together to achieve the long-term the goals of the carbon plan, including a detailed description of the basis for our interconnection limits and why we think that was a reasonable approach to the modeling process, in a way in which it's consistent with many other ways in which modeling has to also be synced with real-world operational considerations. And so that's just but one of many ways in which our modeling is both a math exercise, but also marrying that math exercise with the real world challenges of what it is we're undertaking here in the carbon plan. So again, we hear loud and clear the desire for more information on that. We're working on providing it in a variety of forums, and we believe that through the rest of this carbon plan process, we'll have a lot of chances for folks to understand it even better and give us more feedback as we seek to improve the ways in which we do that. So with that, I'll let Rebecca offer some final thoughts as well.
Jack, I think you've covered it. I think one of the themes that we've heard here has been this connection between transmission, the transmission build out of the future, potential for solar interconnection. And I guess I would just reiterate that these are, what we're doing here is just made up of a whole lot of forecasts and estimates. And so we're working to provide as much clarity as we can based on where we are in the process, underlying what what's driving those estimates. I think that the transmission piece is certainly one that's gotten a lot of attention and that has a lot of attention at the company as well. We look forward to continuing to engage with stakeholders through both the North Carolina Transmission Planning Collaborative process and through other avenues of stakeholder outreach as we go forward to try to marry these processes in a way that just hasn't been a consideration. We've never seen this much attention on the Transmission Planning Collaborative is going on for quite some time. In the stakeholder meeting, Rich Rudica offered for anyone who wants to be a member of a TAG participant, the Transmission Advisory Group, to please sign up, and provided information on how to do that. I don't know that he was expecting that he would have such an outreach as he did by informing the stakeholders of the ways in which they can participate in that process. And so Duke is still, considering how we're going to participate in that process and how we can work with stakeholders to achieve what we all know is required of the future, which is a transmission strategy that supports whatever ends up being in the carbon plan, which is what you will decide. So Thank you for your attention and interest in this. We really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Doolin and Mr. Jurak. I'll see if there are questions for you. Commissioner McKissick.
Yeah, just one quick remark, and that's simply this. I'm pleased to hear your collective comments about continuing the engagement. I think that a lot of concerns raised this morning are genuine concerns that need to be addressed in a meaningful and significant way. And particularly when it comes to the transmission planning and the limitations that are out there, I mean, that needs to be addressed in terms of the inputs that are being reused as data sources. That ought to be a part of it all. So I look forward to this unique collaboration, working with the stakeholder groups as this process moves forward.
All right. With that, I think we are done for the morning. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation today, and we will be adjourned. Thank you. Let's go off the record, please.